Welcome to the first plenary session of our Evangelical Theological Society meeting. The theme of our meeting this year is the New Testament, and I'm very proud to say we have a distinguished textual scholar, author of some books on the syntax of New Testament Greek, a passionate defender of the integrity of the Bible. Dr. Dan Wallace teaches at the Dallas Theological Seminary. He's director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. He told our student body in Convo this morning that he discovered himself 11 more previously unknown manuscripts of the New Testament. I'm probably stealing your thunder there. Just last fall. He loves to poke around old libraries, archives, I guess archaeological digs, all kinds of places, finding these manuscripts and studying them deeply. Tonight he'll be discussing the work of the center, which is absolutely fascinating. You won't want to miss tonight's session. At this session, his topic will be Tischendorf and the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus, a reassessment. Now, I'm not quite sure what there is to be reassessed on that matter, so I'm very curious to hear. Dr. Wallace was born in California. He lives in Texas. He has come all the way east to Virginia to speak to us. So let's give him a warm welcome. Dr. Dan Wallace.
Thanks, Fred. Well, good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Very good. And did they all get the outlines? The outlines for this message? Was that printed off? Yeah, that's okay. I think you all can follow without an outline.
I don't have the outline.
Okay. Well, let's not worry about that. That's okay. I understand. You're woolly-minded. That means you're a professor. So. Oh, okay. All right. Tischendorf and the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus, a reassessment. Most of you have heard the fantastic story of Constantine von Tischendorf's discovery and rescue of Codex Sinaiticus at a monastery in the Middle East and its subsequent journey to the British Library. But it may have been a few years since you read the report in Metzger's text of the New Testament, and the details may be a bit fuzzy. Some of you may have heard of the new finds at St. Catherine's Monastery, the cache of manuscripts stumbled upon in 1975. That is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. But most of you probably have not heard of it at all. This lecture will go over old ground for some, but ground that has become overgrown with weeds. New ground for most, and it will offer a reassessment of Tischendorf and the discovery of Sinaiticus. The reassessment is especially in light of the new finds and my own visit to St. Catherine's Monastery in 2002, along with my frequent correspondence with the librarian of the convent. Before I mention exactly what I am reassessing, I need to offer a little background to two key entities, the monastery at Mount Sinai and the scholar Tischendorf. I'll begin with a brief history of what has become the most famous convent in the world, the Holy Monastery of St. Catherine. This abbey is in Egypt, situated in the Sinai Peninsula, between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba, the two northern prongs of the Red Sea. It is at the base of what many believe is Mount Sinai, and the maps and satellite images of St. Catherine's and the whole area are courtesy of Google. Mount Sinai is the site where Moses met God in the burning bush, where he struck the rock that gave forth water and where he received the Ten Commandments. And the site in the Sinai Peninsula where the monastery is located has a long tradition behind it. Whether this is the authentic Mount Sinai or not is for the archaeologists to debate. As one scholar wrote, a visit to the traditional Mount Sinai suffices to dispel all these doubts. The huge granite formations are an awe-inspiring spectacle. The atmosphere, the light, and the colors, the incredible stillness all conspire to make the scene an unforgettable setting for the meeting of God with man. Of course, that sentiment sounds similar to those who prefer the Garden Tomb to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem as the place of Jesus' burial. in spite of the fact that few scholars today take the Garden Tomb seriously. Whether this Mount Sinai is the Mount Sinai cannot be determined simply on the basis of its inspirational value. When I visited St. Catherine's in September 2002, I asked Father Justin, who was then our host and is now the librarian, if he thought the convent was at the base of the real Mount Sinai where Moses met God. Whether it is or not, the site has been venerated by Christians since the 3rd century, he declared. Thousands of pilgrims over the centuries have come here. For that reason alone, it is a holy site. I got a taste then for what I would come to appreciate about Father Justin. He is as wise as serpents and gentle as doves. What is called Mount Sinai today is known as Jabal Musa in Arabic, or the Mountain of Moses. Christian pilgrims camped out there during the 3rd century. The Emperor Constantine's mother, in her jaunt to verify certain sacred sites in Palestine and the Middle East, declared it authentic. From the 4th century till today, monks have lived there. Because of persistent attacks on the friars by local nomads, finally in the 6th century a monastery was built. It was a towering fortress. The original walls still stand to this day, with the northern face having been repaired by Napoleon during his Egyptian expedition. Justinian, the last Roman emperor whose native tongue was Latin, sought to restore the empire to its former glory. He embarked on an ambitious building program and extended his kingdom in several directions. He was the one who built the monastery. He did so at the urging of the Cenobites, who had settled at Mount Sinai and were living in tents and caves. They petitioned the emperor to build a monastery fort to keep the Bedouins at bay. Nearby, a colony of mercenary soldiers with 200 families was established to further protect the brotherhood. According to tradition, these mercenaries later intermarried with the local Bedouins, forming the tribe of the Jabaliya, who, though having become Muslims, still serve the monastery today. Inside the walls, the only original building that is still there is the sanctuary. There's an ancient inscription on the beams of the church's roof. It reads, "For the salvation of our pious sovereign Justinian, for the memory and rest of our Empress Theodora." We know that Justinian's wife, Theodora, died in 548, and the emperor died 17 years later. Thus, we can pinpoint the building of the cloister to be between 548 and 565. It is the oldest continuously inhabited monastery in the world. And most importantly, it has never suffered serious damage or attack. The monastery was built on the traditional site of the burning bush. You'll notice in the next 3 slides that that bush is still inside the compound. And just in case it catches on fire again, there's an extinguisher close by. Father Justin told me that the bush never needs pruning. With more than 1,000 visitors to the monastery every day, the tourists prune the bush themselves. In the next several slides, you'll see the sanctuary and its northeastern edge, the chapel of the burning bush. Over the centuries, numerous gifts have been given to the convent, including icons, manuscripts, buildings, and today, digital camera equipment. There are more than 2,000 icons at St. Catherine's. This is a surprisingly massive number, but because of its remote location and because it was in Muslim Egypt, it escaped the iconoclast movement of the 8th and 9th centuries. Ironically, the largest collection of icons in the world was protected from marauding Christian zealots by Muslim conquerors. Among its many icons, the most precious is that of the Pantocrator, Christ the Almighty. This was painted in the 6th century and is considered to be the oldest icon of Christ known to exist. There is possibly one painting of Christ that is older. It's in St. Paul's Grotto, a cave on the northern slope of Nightingale Mountain in Ephesus. As you stand in the amphitheater and look out across what used to be the canal to the Aegean, the mountain is on your left. On a trip to photograph New Testament manuscripts in Constantinople in 2004, which I'll briefly tell you about in my lecture tonight, Three of us spent a couple of days touring Ephesus. On the second day, we paid a small sum to the chief archaeologist of Ephesus, who then took us up the mountain to visit a cave that he had recently discovered, which is still not yet open to the public. Inside the grotto were paintings of the 12 apostles, Mary, Paul and Thecla, and Jesus. The painting of Christ is now defaced. It has been dated to sometime between the 4th and 6th centuries. In the least, one can unequivocally say that the painting of the Pantocrator at Mount Sinai is the earliest well-preserved icon of Christ. St. Catherine's Monastery has been described as Christendom's most vivid link with the past. It is a place in which many things remain as they did in the 6th century when the convent was founded. The 7 hours of daily divine services, the liturgy, meals, fasts, clothing, in short, the ascetic life, all have ancient roots. I have been in many Orthodox monasteries. Although each has its own rhythm, its own character, they all share a great deal in common. And what has truly impressed me is how deep their traditions go. But there's one thing that makes St. Catherine significantly different from most other monasteries. I've been in Eastern Orthodox abbeys which segregated the non-Orthodox from the Orthodox during mealtime and liturgical services. At one of these, twice I stood in the narthex during the entire early morning service, which began at 3:30 and did not end until 7 a.m., never being permitted to enter the sanctuary. I was not allowed in the dining room during meals until all the Orthodox had departed. But at two monasteries, the segregation was hardly felt. At the monastery of St. John the Theologian on Patmos, I was invited to sit in the seat of honor in the sanctuary for the dedication of the new museum. An Orthodox friend of mine said that he had never heard of this sort of thing being done. He called it a miracle. And both on Patmos and at St. Catherine's, I ate with the monks and priests. At the monasteries of Mount Athos in northeastern Greece, no women are allowed, nor have they been, for over a millennium. In fact, even the animals must be male. At St. Catherine's, not only are women permitted to be there, but they may even do more. Dr. Barbara Allan, the former director of the Institut für Neutestamentliche Textforschung in Münster, Germany, told me that on her visit to the monastery in the 1980s, she dined with the monks. Why would there be such disparity among Orthodox monasteries regarding outsiders? I can't speak for all of them, but St. Catherine's has been a Christian oasis in a Muslim world almost from the beginning. If the monks did not learn how to get along with their Saracen neighbors, they would not have survived. And this brings me to one of the most unorthodox incidents in the Orthodox monastery's history. In 628, a delegation of monks from St. Catherine's allegedly visited Muhammad, seeking his protection. In response, he allegedly dictated, since he was illiterate, what is known as the patent of Muhammad. There's a great deal of suspicion that the patent is not authentic, but Muslims accept it, because if they were to reject it, and if it proved to be genuine, they would have hell to pay. The patent was reissued every year for centuries. The original document was taken from the monastery to Istanbul in 1517 by the Sultan Salim I, and a copy was left in its place. Here's some salient points in the patent. This is a message from Muhammad ibn Abdullah as a covenant to those who adopt Christianity near and far. We are with them. Verily, I, the servants, the helpers, and my followers defend them, because Christians are my citizens, and by Allah I hold out against anything that displeases them. No compulsion is to be on them. Neither are their judges to be removed from their jobs, nor their monks from their monasteries. No one is to destroy a house of their religion, to damage it, or to carry anything from it to the Muslims' houses. No one of the nation is to disobey the covenant till the last day. Some claim that this may be the most important document in the monastery's vast collection. The Jabaliyah have always honored it. The firman has probably deterred some Muslim forces from harming the monastery. It apparently came in handy in the year 1009. In that year, a man who has been labeled psychotic, and for good reason, Caliph al-Hakim, destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He then set out to destroy St. Catherine's. What happened next varies by accounts. Some reports suggest that monks came out to meet the Caliph, and they showed him the patent of Muhammad, which caused him to turn away. Another is that they met him halfway between Jerusalem and Mount Sinai, imploring him not to destroy the monastery, since it enshrined a holy place to Muslims. Meanwhile, back at the convent, monks were busy capping off a 2-story tower with a minaret, effectively turning the tower into a mosque. Its minaret is of inferior construction, one scholar noted, suggesting that the mosque was built in a very short time. But the mosque seems to have been built about 100 years later, in 1106, during the reign of one of al-Hakim's successors. There's an inscription, in fact, that gives that date for the completion of the mosque. The mosque was used occasionally for worship services by Muslims up through the middle of the 19th century. Whether the monks built a mosque in time to deter al-Hakim, or more likely, showed him the patent, they exercised great ingenuity in diffusing the situation. And because they did, when Tischendorf visited the abbey in the mid-1800s, there was a particularly old manuscript waiting for him. Born in 1815, Lobegot Friedrich Constantin von Tischendorf grew up during the rise of the Tübingen School, spearheaded by F.C. Bauer. Bauer, by applying Hegelian dialectic to the New Testament, asserted that Paul wrote only 4 epistles ascribed to him. John's gospel was not written until AD 70, and the historical narratives in the New Testament were pure myth. In the face of Bauer and the Tübingen School, Tischendorf became driven by an evangelical zeal to find the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament in order to give greater certainty to the wording of the original and greater claim of its historical reliability. In 1841, he visited the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and deciphered a 5th century New Testament parchment that had been scraped clean centuries after its original composition by a scribe who then penned Ephraim the Syrian's sermons on top. Such reused manuscripts are known as palimpsests. Scribes in the Middle Ages frequently gave into the temptation to cannibalize old parchments rather than use fresh hides and take them through the arduous process of preparing them for usage as a usable writing surface. It got so bad that Charlemagne made an edict against the palimpsest work, but to no avail. Today, many of our New Testament manuscripts are the undertext of a palimpsest. The manuscript in Paris is known as Ephraemi Rescriptus, or Codex C. The undertext was so difficult to read that all of Tischendorf's predecessors had failed at the task. In the 1830s, long before Tischendorf came to Paris, chemical reagents were applied to the manuscript. Even with the reagents, Tischendorf had a hard time reading it. But after 2 years of work, he was able to decipher 99% of the text. This brought him immediate fame as a textual critic, and it paved the way for funding for his next project. In the spring of 1844, under the patronage of Frederick of Saxony, he ventured to the Middle East in the search of biblical manuscripts. Taking a 12-day, sometimes harrowing camel ride from Cairo with Bedouin guides, he finally arrived at St. Catherine's. In order to gain access to the monastery, he needed to have a letter of recommendation. Then, after it was verified, he was hoisted by rope up the northern wall to a covered shack 30 feet off the ground. You can see some pictures here of the shack, which until 1861 was the only way in which visitors could gain entrance into the abbey. And the rope pulley system still works today, even though few visitors want to take it to get inside. Notice the net that is used at another monastery. This net was used at one of the monasteries of Matera in central Greece, which are as high as 1,000 feet above the valley below. Only a rope was needed at St. Catherine's. In Tischendorf's own words, it was in April 1844 that I embarked at Leghorn for Egypt. The desire which I felt to discover some precious remains of any manuscripts, more especially biblical, of a date which would carry us back to the early times of Christianity, was realized beyond my expectations. It was at the foot of Mount Sinai, in the convent of St. Catherine, that I discovered the pearl of all my researches. In visiting the library of the monastery in the month of May 1844, I perceived in the middle of the great hall a large and wide basket full of old parchments. And the librarian, who was a man of information, told me that 2 heaps of papers like these, moldered by time, had been already committed to the flames. What was my surprise to find amid this heap of papers was a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, which seemed to be one of the most ancient that I had ever seen. The authorities of the convent allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, or about 43 sheets, all the more readily as they were destined for the fire. But I could not get them to yield up possession of the remainder. The too lively satisfaction which I had displayed had aroused their suspicions as to the value of this manuscript. I enjoined on the monks to take religious care of all such remains which might fall in their way. Constantine Tischendorf was 29 years old. Tischendorf returned to Sinai in 1853, but he received no help from the monks regarding the now famous Codex. They feigned no knowledge of the manuscript. He did, however, manage to acquire a small fragment of 11 lines of Genesis from this Codex, which was being used as a bookmark. How he acquired it is not known. It was on that visit that he gave the monastery a very important gift, the second edition of his Greek New Testament, in which he penned in modern Greek a note of appreciation to the Holy Fraternity. This note will become important in our later discussion. Now, Tischendorf returned once more to Sinai in 1859. This time he went under the patronage of Tsar Alexander II. Back to Tischendorf's own words. Several motives, and more especially the deep reverence of all Eastern monasteries for the Emperor of Russia, led me in the autumn of 1856 to submit to the Russian government a plan of a journey for making systematic researches in the East. This proposal only aroused a jealous and fanatical opposition in St. Petersburg. People were astonished that a foreigner and a Protestant should presume to ask the support of the Emperor of the Greek and Orthodox Church for a mission to the East. But the good cause triumphed. The interest which my proposal excited, even within the imperial circle, inclined the emperor in my favor. It obtained his approval in the month of September 1858, and the funds which I asked for were placed at my disposal. In the commencement of January 1859, I again set sail for the East. After spending a few days in the monastery examining significant manuscripts, though nothing compared to Sinaiticus, Tischendorf was about to leave. His narrative continues. On the 4th of February, I was taking a walk with the steward of the convent in the neighborhood, and as we returned toward sunset, he begged me to take some refreshment with him in his cell. Scarcely had he entered the room when, resuming our former subject of conversation, he said, "And I too have read a Septuagint." And so saying, he took down from the corner of the room a bulky kind of volume, wrapped up in a red cloth, and he laid it before me. I unrolled the cover and discovered, to my great surprise, not only those very fragments which 15 years before I had taken out of the basket, but also other parts of the Old Testament, the New Testament complete, and in addition, the Epistle of Barnabas and a part of the Shepherd of Hermas. Full of joy, which this time I had the self-command to conceal from the steward and the rest of the community, I asked, as if in a careless way, for permission to take the manuscript into my sleeping chamber to look it over more at leisure. I knew that I held in my hand the most precious biblical treasure in existence, a document whose age and importance exceeded that of all the manuscripts which I ever examined during 20 years' study and research. It should be noted that the details of all three of Tischendorf's visits to Mount Sinai have never been corroborated by anyone or anything else. But once Codex Sinaiticus made its way out of St. Catherine's, Tischendorf becomes just one of many voices claiming that their story is the true one. And the sound is a veritable cacophony. There is simply too much material to go through in a short lecture such as this, so I will highlight certain points. After unsuccessful negotiations with the monastery to remove the manuscript for examination, Tischendorf left empty-handed. But later he persuaded the abbot to permit him to examine the manuscript in Cairo, where there was a daughter convent of St. Catherine's. The abbot agreed, and under close watch, in a 2-month period, Tischendorf and 2 assistants transcribed more than 110,000 lines of text. At least that's what Tischendorf's son-in-law claimed. But if so, why then did Tischendorf need to take the manuscript to St. Petersburg to have it copied accurately so that a facsimile could be made? That task would take another 3 years. Something in the story just doesn't seem to add up. As satisfying as the feat of such a massive transcription, if it really happened, must have been, it was not enough. Tischendorf wanted to get the manuscript published, and he wanted it to find a home away from the Egyptian sands. The German scholar never really had very high respect for the monks of Sinai. He disliked their manner and thought their 7 hours of daily prayer could be better spent studying Scripture. And their treatment of Holy Writ was hardly the same as a Protestant scholar's. As a later fictional protege of Tischendorf would say, this piece belongs in a museum. At this point in our story, the reports get a little foggy. In the text of the New Testament, Bruce Metzger says that Tischendorf suggested that it would be to the monks' advantage if they made a gift to the Tsar of Russia, whose influence as protector of the Greek church they desired in connection with the election of the new archbishop. And what could be more appropriate as a gift than this ancient Greek manuscript? The Codex was then sent to St. Petersburg, and 10 years after its discovery was on display in the National Library in Russia. Metzger's text of the New Testament, from the first edition in 1964 to the fourth, co-authored by Bart Ehrman in 2005, leaves the distinct impression that Tischendorf was simply shrewd in brokering the gift of Sinaiticus in exchange for the appointment of the archbishop that St. Catherine's monks wanted. This is the text that most of us were weaned on in matters related to New Testament textual criticism. That is Metzger's text, not Sinaiticus. Buried in a footnote, however, we see different views on these events to which we will return momentarily. Suffice it to say that Metzger's massive influence, coupled with a somewhat one-sided view of things, has contributed heavily to the Western perception of the monks of Sinai as careless about their treasures and no better than Esau, who sold his birthright for a mess of porridge. Before we look at the journey of Sinaiticus to England and the new finds, a brief note should be mentioned of perhaps the most bizarre aspect of this whole story. When Tischendorf brought the manuscript to Europe, the news was electrifying. This was the oldest complete New Testament, and still is, by 500 years, and the only one written in majuscule or uncial script. It was also the only Greek manuscript to have 4 columns per page, and was the largest format Greek manuscript ever discovered. Besides that, it had the Epistle of Barnabas in it, a document only known by ancient testimony until the discovery of Sinaiticus. And it differed markedly from the Byzantine text. So many unique features. All this sounded too good to be true, and to some it was. In particular, one Constantine Simonides, a Greek man whom Tischendorf had exposed as a forger, although a brilliant forger, decided to burst Tischendorf's bubble. Writing in the British magazine The Guardian on the 3rd of September 1862, Simonides claimed that he penned Sinaiticus in 1840. He created quite a stir. Several publications declared that Tischendorf had lied on the basis of Simonides' letter. They were all too ready to condemn him. The reason? It was simply too fantastic to believe that a complete New Testament had been found, let alone such an old one, and that it differed markedly from the Byzantine text. There are some today, in fact, who still cling to the notion that Simonides was indeed the forger of the manuscript, in large measure because they don't care for the fact that such an old manuscript would part company from the Textus Receptus. Samuel Prideaux Tregelles wrote to F.J.A. Hort after examining the manuscript for several days, "I know of no reason for judging it to be more recent than the 4th century." And I need hardly say that the story of Simonides, that he wrote the manuscript, is as false and absurd as possible. A man might as well pretend that the Alexandrian and the Vatican manuscript is a modern work. Henry Bradshaw, the keeper of the manuscripts at Cambridge University Library, visited Tischendorf in Leipzig in July 1862, and he declared, "For myself, I have no hesitation in saying that I'm absolutely certain of the genuineness and antiquity of the Codex Sinaiticus, as I am of my own existence." More can be said. First, if Simonides penned Sinaiticus, his wealth must have been vast in light of how much it would have cost to produce this manuscript. It was made up originally of 365 animal skins. According to one estimate, the cost of production would be roughly the equivalent of a lifetime of work. But when Simonides supposedly penned it, he was only 20 years old. And this manuscript was, in his own admission, the poor work of his youth. Second, in 1761, an Italian scholar, Vitaliano Donati, visited St. Catherine's and described a manuscript he saw there that matches Sinaiticus to a T. This was 79 years before Simonides forged it, and 59 years before Simonides was born. Third, the new finds in 1975 revealed that more leaves of the manuscript were still at Sinai. How did they get there if Simonides forged the manuscript somewhere else? Well, the Codex resided in St. Petersburg until 1933. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the new communist government was badly in need of funds, especially so once the Depression began to sweep over the world. Through a London bookseller, the British government purchased the manuscript from Russia for £100,000, approximately $500,000 in that day. This was, at the time, the most money ever spent for a manuscript. Nowadays, manuscripts go for a whole lot more than that. P75 was sold by the Bodmers to the Vatican for an undisclosed price, but Yale University offered $50 million for it, and they were turned down. Now, this was, at the time, the most money ever paid for a manuscript. The British raised the money through subscription, promising to pay half the bill out of the government's coffers if individual citizens would donate the rest. The British citizenry did much more than comply. They gave far more than half the price for the manuscript. The Codex came to the British Museum on December 27th, 1933. According to one source, many British wrote to their American friends and relatives who, in turn, contributed heavily to the purchase of the Codex. In exchange, several papyri were sent to American universities, perhaps as a guilt offering. So next time you're at the British Library, just ask if you can borrow Sinaiticus and bring it back to America to reside for the next 80 years, and we'll give them back those papyri. I've thought about doing that. In 1973, when the British Library separated from the British Museum, Codex Sinaiticus moved with it. It now sits in the John Ritblat Gallery, next to Codex Alexandrinus, and not too far away from a first edition of the Beatles' White Album. Now, back to Tischendorf and St. Catherine's. We all know about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi codices. But very close in importance to these remarkable discoveries is another event that occurred at St. Catherine's in the 20th century. In November 1971, a fire broke out at St. George's Tower on the north wall. After sufficient funds were raised to do some restoration, the archimandrite Sophronius began the cleaning project on May 25th, 1975. On the outer part of the wall facing the ancient sanctuary was a wide opening that had been filled in with earth and wood. Sophronius was tasked with cleaning this up before restoration of the wall could begin. But as some of the rubble was being removed by Bedouin assistants, he noticed a small piece of parchment in the debris. As he dug further into the opening in the wall the next day, he found a complete manuscript leaf. Day after day, he made his way further into the abandoned room and found more and more leaves, manuscript leaves. But he had no flashlight, only an oil lamp. The dust was so thick that the oil lamp did virtually no good. He had to grope his way through the dust and dark, trying not to damage any leaf fragments that would be in his path. He would usually last only 2 or 3 hours before the dust choked him too much and he'd have to depart. On June 5th, 1975, he discovered a large 4-column manuscript leaf with capital letters written in the columns. It was a leaf from Codex Sinaiticus, from the book of Numbers. As the days continued on and as the Scivophilix did his work in secret, telling only the archbishop about his discoveries, more leaves of Sinaiticus were found, and many other manuscripts too. After 44 days of physically painful work in oppressive conditions, Sophronius had filled 47 large boxes with manuscripts and manuscript fragments. He estimated that they weighed about 2,000 pounds altogether, 1 ton. But what had he found? Now the busy work of cleaning, stretching, and cataloging had to be done. The National Library in Athens sent scholars to help decipher the manuscripts. After 23 years, they published their findings in a catalog called The New Finds. At first, it was published only in Greek, and I received my copy from Father Justin just weeks after it came out. The next year, in 1999, an English translation also appeared. What was in this forgotten storeroom? About 1,200 manuscripts and 50,000 fragments of manuscripts. Among these were hundreds of liturgical, patristic, and miscellaneous books. Also, 150 Septuagint manuscripts, 90 New Testament manuscripts, and 12 complete leaves and 14 fragments of Codex Sinaiticus. The Codex is probably the oldest manuscript in the find, though there are some papyrus fragments that are yet to be analyzed. The latest manuscript is from the 18th century. Archbishop Damianus had suspected for some time that there might be treasures hidden in the northern wall of the monastery. This was where the sacristy had been previously. When I visited St. Catherine's in 2002 with a colleague from Dallas Seminary and an Orthodox priest, I had the opportunity to examine 4 Greek manuscripts in the New Finds collection. The librarian, Father Simeon, told us that we were the first outsiders permitted to examine any of the Greek New Finds manuscripts. Remarkably, while looking at just 4 manuscripts during the 8 days we were there, I discovered another 2 within them. As I examined a majuscule of Paul's letters from the 9th century, I began to notice undertext that had been scraped away. It turned out to be a majuscule of the major prophets. The upper text is now identified as Gregory Olland 0278, but the undertext is still being analyzed. Majuscule manuscripts of the prophets are exceedingly rare. I also came to the monastery to transcribe the text of the Proto-Evangelium of James. This was an ancient apocryphal work that even the archbishop did not know that they had a copy of. It enjoyed wide popularity even through the Middle Ages. As I worked through the Codex, I noticed halfway through, when we switched to a second quire, that the text had changed. I was on a new fold or quire and was no longer reading the Proto-Evangelium. Instead, it became the Assumption of the Virgin. This was a very rare find. As far as I know, there are only 5 copies of the Assumption in Greek that are still extant. 5 copies. This one is coeval with the oldest of them. During our week at the monastery, I spent much time with Father Justin. He is the only American to ever find his home at St. Catherine's. He used to be known as Russell Hicks of El Paso. Now Father Justin Sinaiticus is his name. After Simeon retired, Father Justin was asked by the Archbishop to assume the role of librarian. Expensive digital camera equipment was installed, and he is filling his spare time with the painstaking task of digitizing the entire collection of St. Catherine's Library. With the new finds, the count now comes to about 3,300 manuscripts, second only to the Vatican in the world in terms of its manuscript holdings. Father Justin at one point took us to the Geniza, where the new finds manuscripts had been discovered. It was nearly pitch black in the room. The only way we could see anything was when the flash went off on the camera. You will notice in the pictures that the room is quite filthy and that it has a kind of a loft with a couple of smaller compartments as well. Notice also the weave baskets on the floor, now useless. These same baskets were the kind that were used to carry manuscripts, as in this room and in the library, and kindling for the fires. There is an extensive amount of work to be done on the new finds manuscripts, which are in almost a dozen different languages. So if you have a hankering to visit Egypt, write to Father Justin sometime to see if you might be able to examine one or two of the manuscripts. Just to digitize the collection, Father Justin once told me, would take 300 years at the current pace. But the Archbishop is very pro-technology, and the monastery isn't going anyplace. Finally, I want to put all this together and make a reassessment of the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus. Here are the salient facts and issues regarding Tischendorf's discovery. First of all, the new finds manuscripts are a game changer, in my opinion. Except for the scrap of parchment from Genesis used as a bookmark, Tischendorf never found any part of the Old Testament earlier than 1 Chronicles. This allowed him to claim that the monks had been tearing out leaves of the Codex and consigning them to the flames. But when leaves from the Pentateuch were discovered, in 1975, as well as leaves from the Shepherd of Hermas, a different picture emerges. As is well known, because it is everyone's experience, the outer leaves of books tend to fall off. Just take a look at some of the well-worn paperbacks in your personal library sometime. Now, if the monks had been ripping leaves out of the Codex and tossing them page by page into the fire, one would expect the beginning of the Old Testament to go first. But if leaves from the Pentateuch and from the Shepherd of Hermas were discovered in 1975, then a different explanation comes to mind. These would have been part of the outer quires of the Codex. Rather than burning up these leaves, the monks had moved the manuscripts from one part of the compound to another, and the outer leaves on several manuscripts had simply been left behind. Second, the latest manuscript stored in the Geniza was from the 18th century. This is significant because it shows that the practices of the monks close to the time that Tischendorf came there was to store manuscripts instead of burn them. This is in keeping with the practices known from antiquity of Christian and Jewish scribes. The great papyrologist C.H. Roberts, who in 1934 discovered P52, the oldest New Testament manuscript, gave the prestigious Schweik Lectures at Oxford University in 1977. And he made the following comments about manuscript preservation. It was a Jewish habit, both to preserve manuscripts by placing them in jars and also to dispose of defective, worn out, or heretical scriptures by burying them near a cemetery. Roberts gave several examples of both kinds of preservation. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Chester Beatty Papyri, the Nag Hammadi Codices, a Greek Psalter, and a Coptic copy of John's Gospel, ranging over several centuries, were either put in jars or buried, but they were not destroyed. Roberts then adds, if the hypothesis is accepted that Christians adopted the Jewish institute of a Geniza or depository for manuscripts, it would also explain why a collection such as the Chester Beatty or Bodmer includes manuscripts of differing date and occasionally more than one copy of the same book. They would have been deposited at different times. Roberts did not know about the new finds at the time of these lectures. It seems that the monks of Sinai were following an old tradition of walling up disused and worn-out manuscripts and leaves of manuscripts that were on the outside of books, rather than burning them, as Tischendorf claimed. As I've already argued, the monks at Sinai give us a window on the past. It would be unthinkable for them to change their modus operandi of how they dealt with manuscripts within the space of a century. In fact, some scholars would say that there is virtually no actual evidence that Christian scribes ever destroyed copies of Scripture. In the least, I think it highly unlikely that they would have been doing this at Sinai, especially since that monastery had a long tradition of its own manuscript production. Third, we know that the monastery's manuscripts were kept in more than one location for many centuries. In the mid-1700s, a central location on the south wall was created. But even then, there was no rigorous system of keeping the manuscripts in the library. They would be spread out in several sites. And as Archbishop Damianus suspected, a logical place for a storeroom of old discarded parchments would be close to the sacristy, where the more sacred vessels and liturgical items would be kept. Since the common library was across the compound, it makes sense that a smaller library may well have been at St. George's Tower. The very fact that a monk in 1859 could show Tischendorf a 4th century majuscule, which he kept in his cell, is testimony to the fact that although they may have been careless about where the manuscripts were, this does not mean that they were tossing them to the flames. Fourth, even apart from the long-held traditions about the sacredness of manuscripts and other artifacts that the monks of Sinai would surely have embraced, there is the great implausibility that they were burning parchment leaves. Parchment is very difficult to burn, and the heat generated cannot offset the vicious attack on the olfactory and ocular organs. Fifth, if Tischendorf took the 43 Old Testament leaves in 1844 without permission from the archbishop at least, perhaps buying them from one of the monks, this may account for why he was met with stubborn silence about the rest of the Codex on his second visit to the monastery in 1853. It certainly is not unheard of that the Orthodox would give manuscripts as gifts to outsiders. Recall the gift of Codex Alexandrinus to King Charles in 1627 by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Cyril Lucar. Nor were they averse to selling them. But if Tischendorf, as a man barely 29 years old, did not follow strict protocol at the monastery, he would at least have received the cold shoulder on a later visit. This is the same today. At some of the stricter monasteries, if a scholar has not submitted in writing weeks in advance a request to examine a particular manuscript, he may not do so even if he is sitting right next to the manuscript in the library. I even know of one scholar who was permanently banned from returning to a convent because he asked if he could look at a manuscript which he had not requested in writing previously. Sixth, did Tischendorf fabricate his story of the monks burning leaves of manuscripts? Perhaps. The new finds certainly cast the most serious doubts on his narrative. After all, what he took from Sinai would be perceived better if it looked like a rescue mission rather than a theft. Alternatively, he may have been mistaken, and he filled in some of the details that were simply not true. The same kinds of woven baskets that were found in the Geniza had been used to carry both manuscripts and firewood. If Tischendorf did not go into one of the kitchens when the monks were baking bread, but stood outside the doorway during the prayer over the bread and the stoking of the fires, he would no doubt have seen the woven baskets near the oven. And he could have assumed that what was going into the ovens were manuscript leaves rather than some other kinds of kindling. From there, he could have easily added vividness to his story as though he were present with the monks when they were tossing the kindling into the furnace. We know that his modern Greek was abysmal at this time. He claimed that he could neither understand what the Greeks were saying nor they him because of his Erasmian pronunciation. And that raises the question as to who at the monastery would communicate with him. I know the feeling. On one of my expeditions to Greece, I visited the island of Lesbos and went to a retirement home which owned its own Greek New Testament manuscript. What on earth would a retirement home be doing with a lectionary manuscript? When I got there, I inquired about the document. No one understood me. But when I wrote down my request, the doors of communication swung wide open. In 1960, a Russian scholar, Igor Sevchenko, while visiting St. Catherine's, discovered a note penned by Tischendorf in which he promised to return Codex Sinaiticus whenever they asked for it back. If this note is authentic, it raises serious doubts about whether the convent really intended to give the Codex as a gift to the Tsar. Just the text of its contents were published by Sevchenko in 1964. But here's a photograph of the note, written in modern Greek, and the photograph is courtesy of Father Justin. And here's the translation. I, the undersigned, Constantine Tischendorf, attest that the Holy Confraternity of Mount Sinai has delivered to me as a loan an ancient manuscript of both Testaments, being the property of the aforesaid monastery and containing 346 leaves and a small fragment. These I shall take with me to St. Petersburg in order that I may collate the copy previously made by me with the original at the time of publication of the manuscript. This manuscript I promise to return, undamaged and in a good state of preservation, to the Holy Confraternity of Sinai at its earliest request. Eighth, is this document authentic? Did Tischendorf really write it? As we saw earlier, St. Catherine's brothers were apparently not above forging a document to save their skins. They almost surely did this with the patent of Muhammad several centuries earlier. Is it possible that now they forged Tischendorf's signature and note in an attempt to get their manuscripts back? In my visit to Sinai in 2002, I asked the then librarian, Father Simeon, if he had any other written documents by Tischendorf. He thought long and hard, and then, as though a light suddenly came on, he replied, yes, he penned a note in the front of his Greek New Testament that he gave to St. Catherine's on his second visit in 1853. I had seen this New Testament in the library display case earlier on my visit, but it was a closed book. So I asked Father Simeon if I could see the note and photograph it. He brought the book to me and granted me permission, and here is the photograph. And the text reads, the present New Testament has been published or written as a small gift by me, the undersigned, for the Common Library of Sinai. In the month of May, 1853, Constantine Tischendorf. To my knowledge, since the memo of 1859 at St. Catherine's has never been published, no one has evaluated the handwriting to make sure it is Tischendorf's. But we now have a standard of comparison, the note in the New Testament that Tischendorf definitely penned in 1853. Since Father Simeon was not in the least going out of his way to prove the authenticity of the signature, and since, to my knowledge, no one else had ever taken a photograph of it, any motive for forgery vanishes. So what do the two documents tell us? First of all, the Greek handwriting is almost identical between the two. But second, there are two major differences. One, Tischendorf messed up in the writing of his own name in 1853, forgetting the new after the omega in Konstantinos, which he then corrected. And two, in his note in the New Testament, the surname is not properly introduced, with the genitive Tischendorfu coming immediately after the nominative article ha, while in the promise of 1859 he writes more properly ha tu and then Tischendorfu. How can these discrepancies be explained? Since the note written in 1853 is indisputably Tischendorf's, one cannot attribute the forgetting of the new to a forger. And the reason for the more correct ha tu in 1859 is most likely due to Tischendorf's increasing comfort in composing Greek. The discrepancies, therefore, rather than suggesting that the memo promising to return the manuscript is a fake, argue that it is authentic. It fits well with the growing ease that the German scholar would have in composing Greek, and further, still displays an awkwardness with the language. Again, something that a forger would hardly reproduce. In conclusion, there is still much to learn about Tischendorf's visits to St. Catherine's, and there are many questions left unanswered, at least for now. But what has been presented in the West for many decades, that the original Indiana Jones rescued one of the most important biblical manuscripts from destruction just in the nick of time, is almost surely a myth. And in the end, this has the salutary effect of restoring the Sinai Brotherhood to its rightful place of honor. Thank you.